of the Lord this morning. This week's sermon stems out of a conversation I was having earlier this week that made a particular verse stick out in my mind. I'll be starting out in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now, 1 Corinthians 13:13. But now faith, hope, love, abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. Now, I started out in the New American Standard because that's what I always read out of. However, that verse says something different if you're reading in King James. Now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three, but the greatest of these three is charity. Now, a lot of times when we're reading translations, we see words used a little bit differently, and more often than not, you say, well, these are words that are kind of interchangeable for each other. The average person, when you say charity and love, we take these as two totally different concepts. We think it's totally possible to be a good, loving person and to not be charitable. And we can believe at times, and more often than not, the way people approach this is that it is possible to be charitable without being loving. There's a reason these two words are used. They should be interchangeable. And in all honesty, when you're looking at the original Greek, the word has both implications. That's why we see this in two different translations. Now, of course, if you're following along in the NIV, I do believe the NIV uses love as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, that does not mean the King James is wrong. It just means the translators, when they were reading the King James, leaned towards the charity side of things, and the other translators have leaned more towards love. But like I said, these two should be going hand in hand. More often than not, in today's society, when it comes to charity, most people are giving in a grudging spirit, not a loving spirit. They're giving out of a compulsion that they feel they need to, that they have to, but they don't want to. And more often than not, that error is also presented when they're giving. But we're to be giving in a spirit of love. Instead of being two separate concepts, these should be two inseparable concepts. Because just as when you're being charitable, you should be loving. Any person that wants to be loving should be charitable. Now, a husband and a wife, great example of this. If I always look at it and say, I love you, but I'm not willing to give her anything, do anything for her, she's not going to believe that I love her that much. When we say that we love somebody, but we're not willing to give them the time of day to help them when we see that they need help, to do things for them, now, doing it in that spirit of love, not that grudging that is also often the way we do things in today's society. When we're being required to take our time away from ourselves and to do for somebody else. Because Jesus says, greater love has no man than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. Now, the common that everybody always wants to go straight to that is that you were willing to die for someone else. But when you lay down your life, you're taking time out of your life, the things that you want to do, the things that you want to focus on, the things that are me being me, and setting those aside and giving that time to somebody else. And not doing it with that sour grimace, that really don't want to be here. I really don't want to be doing this, but it's my duty. Because that's not doing it in a spirit of love. Matthew 22, verses 34 to 38. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Now, the first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, God is love, as John clearly tells us. And we're to love God, imitate God, do what God wants us to do. With all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. We're to love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, I've heard the argument before of, well, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Well, I wouldn't mind somebody doing that way to me, but that's not really what you'd be able to accept. How you really want people to interact with you. How you really want people to treat you. Now this again is that love that is inseparable with charity. Because when you're loving your neighbor as yourself, you're not just going to, in passing, go, you know, I love you, Uncle Steve, I love you, Uncle James, but never take time to ask you anything. That's not a charitable love. That's just a passive. It's not going to be saying you love somebody to somebody you meet and going on, forgetting about them, doing nothing for them. When you see they need help. It's all fine and dandy to tell somebody you love them. And in all honesty, that's one of the basic desires that we as humans have, is to hear somebody say that they love us. It's one of those basic things that we are driven for and that helps fulfill us. But we need more than to just hear it. We need to be able to see it. We need to be able to understand it. It does me no good to tell you I love you and never talk about you. It does me no good to tell you I love you and never be willing to do anything for you. Does you no good for me to tell you that? You know, this even falls into where a lot of churches will talk about the love of Christ, and there's still a lot of the people in that congregation will come together for Sunday. Then go apart and not care any about the rest of the congregation for the remainder of the week. Now, maybe some of this is hitting at me, because where I stay so busy with work and classes, I don't take enough time to check up on all of you all the time. And I really feel that I should. So perhaps some of this sermon is meant for me. But in that love, we need to show charity. And charity is one of these words that, unfortunately, we as a culture have taken almost to mean something bad if you're the recipient of charity. How many times when you're trying to do something nice for somebody, they'll say, I don't want your charity. And it's because that charity is being given with the improper spirit. It's not being given in the spirit of love, trying to take care of them. Showing them that you're there, that you're their support. It's the, well, here you go, or a good example is, John, come up here for a second. A lot of charity that comes across nowadays is, here you go. Go on, take it. Take it. Take it. Well, if you can really have it, you can take it. Go sit down. But that's just it. Rather than freely giving, we want to hold on to it and make them work for it away from us instead of giving to them. We want them, rather than us freely giving, I'm going to borrow one of the Second Amendment slogans at the moment, you can pry it from my cold dead hands. It's more often than not how we give anymore. It's, we'll hold it out, but without any expect that somebody's going to take it, and we will do everything we can to hold on to it and keep them from taking it. That's not what we've been called to do. That's not giving in a loving charity. That's would be more akin to the Pharisees wanting to sound the trumpet when they would give. Wanting to draw attention and showing, well, I'm saying I'm willing to give, but nobody's willing to take me up on it. Which Jesus addresses in Matthew 6:2. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. In other words, we don't make a big show when we're giving something. We don't want to draw everybody's attention to the fact that we're giving something. We want the gift to be something that the person can enjoy without... When you make a big show out of giving something to somebody, it lets everybody see the fact that this person is vulnerable and that they have a need. Now, there's one thing we as humans often hate, and that is our vulnerabilities and weaknesses being exposed to others. So even though we may have had the right intention that we wanted to give it, but when we make this big show of it and we want to do it in front of a bunch of people, we're harming that person. One of the songs that we sing a lot is, we will work together as Christians, we will work together side by side, we will save each man's dignity. When we bring them up and make a show of it, that we need to give them something, we're not saving their dignity. Now, so important is it in giving to charity Colossians 3:14 to 15. And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfection, or the bond of perfectness. Again, I'm reading it out of the King James. Because again, the other translations substitute love for charity. That does not mean that the King James Version is wrong. It means that the original Greek that's used allows for both. And it's because, all right, in English we have one broad word for love. Greek has quite a few. So we can take it, and in English it means one thing or possibly another, depending on how we want to draw the alliteration of the word. That's why translations, and there's so many of them, can seem confusing as to why they say different things. When two different people go back and look at the source material, they'll often come up with two different meanings because something doesn't perfectly translate from one language to another, just due to grammar, sentence structure, and meaning of word. But again, put on love or charity. Keep in mind, my whole premise this morning is these two things are inseparable. If you want to be loving, you need to be charitable. If you want to be charitable, you need to be loving. They are the same. And we'll come back again to what I said. Always take the example of a husband and wife. Paul uses this imagery to illustrate that we, the church, will be the bride of Christ. Now, we expect that Christ will be charitable with us. How much more charitable and loving could He possibly be than to take the place of us and die for our sins so that we would not have to? And we're given that in the image of husband and wife. He's that loving to us. So we should be that loving with the rest of the world. James chapter 1. Verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Now, to visit widows and orphans in their distress sounds a bit confusing. In other words, to take care of those in need. So let's re-say that. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God is taking care of those who are in need. Now that flies in the face of American culture, doesn't it? Where American culture is all about taking care of el numero uno. Number one, me, myself, and I. And all about the almighty dollar. Pure and undefiled religion is not about taking care of me. It's about taking care of those who are in need. That's a pretty powerful statement. Yet, again, it's one of those things, if we stop and look at it, what does the average person consider a religious person? Sadly, all too often, the cultural norm of what a person expects a religious person to be is someone who is extremely uptight, more concerned about the morality of things, not really willing to help out. You know, sadly, that image relates right back to the Pharisees. And that's not what James says pure religion in the sight of God should be. Pure religion in the sight of God is taking care of other people, being loving and charitable. Now, Jesus even emphasizes this point in Matthew 10:21, and then we'll also flip to Luke chapter 12. Okay, I wrote down the reference for Matthew 10:21 incorrectly. That's not the verse I want, so we'll go on to Luke chapter 12. Luke 12, starting at verse 32. Do not be afraid, little flock. Sorry, got tongue tied. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We get so tied up and caught up in possessions that we allow them to take the place of God. That's one of the reasons we're called to be so charitable with other people, is so that we do not let what we have become our God. We share and share alike. We give without concern of being given back. We take care of those in need. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us basically, be content with food and clothing. Anything else is a plus. But as long as we've got food and clothing, we should be content. And that means if we see a brother over there in need, because we have more than him, we should be willing to take care of him. Should we see a sister in need, we should be willing to take care of her. It doesn't matter what this world's view on pure religion is. Pure and undefiled religion in the eyes of God is taking care of those in need. If we read 1 Corinthians 13, we often take this as the love chapter. And yes, it is talking about love, but it's also talking about charity. Now, this is how I'm going to close out my sermons. I'm going to read this out of the King James, because the way it puts it really drives home how we should be with charity. 1 Corinthians 13:1. Though I speak with tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass, or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But whenever there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whenever there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part and prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which was in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, understood as a child, thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now, though we see through a glass darkly, but the face is a face, now I see in part, but then I shall know, even as I am also known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity. So charity is important. Charity is inseparable from love. We cannot truly be a charitable person if we're not loving. And we cannot be a loving person as we are called to do if we're not charitable. Now that's all I have to say for this morning.